casualties now. 5 major hospitals have come under attack in Syria over the last 48 hours.
23 people died in the airstrikes. Turkey's putting that figure at more than 60.
The UN has accused pro-government forces of targeting the Idlib hospital itself.
There were 2 hospitals hit overnight.
Airstrikes
Both put out
hit
of
2
action.
hospitals and a
But now there are
school
just
in
6
northern
left.
Syria.
By April 2016, half of Aleppo's population of 3 million were gone, displaced, in flight, dead or injured. Many who remained lived under siege with few means to escape, as Syrian President Bashar al-Assad's military attempted to destroy rebel forces in the city. Aleppo's medical community, targeted and in collapse, struggled to continue. Dr. Mohammed Wasim Muaz, one of the city's last remaining pediatricians, was among a small group of doctors who vowed to keep working despite the dangers. He's seen here as he began his shift at Al-Quds General Hospital. It's the last time anyone saw him alive. He was killed when aircraft struck the medical facility with missiles.
We were so surprised and shocked when we saw our colleagues covered with their blood and giving their last breaths.
Neurosurgeon Dr. Rami Kalazi and staff at a nearby hospital tried to save victims of the attack, including severely injured health colleagues.
I don't know how to describe that. It's so hard emotionally. It's like you are losing one of your precious in front of your eyes.
55 people died in the attack. Among them, 2 doctors, 2 nurses, a technician, and a guard.
This attack fits the Assad regime's abhorrent pattern of striking first responders.
The Syrian government and Russia, its close partner in executing the air war, denied targeting the hospital. Hundreds of similar attacks upon civilian infrastructure followed. The world, already numb to the continuous cycle of atrocities in Syria, barely took notice.
This is unprecedented in the post-Cold War era. Certainly we've had crises, certainly we've had violations of international law, but no one has behaved in the way that the Russians/Syrians have in intentional infliction of human rights violations, killing, manslaughter, gas in the case of Bashar Assad, and there's been very little international reaction to it, except for an occasional headline. That's very dispiriting.
Syria's war took off like a rocket in early 2011, quickly assuming a ferocious scale and intensity unlike anything we had seen in the Middle East, and it's continued unabated until today. We were caught flat-footed and unprepared, fatigued by the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq.
The war in Syria represents a new low for the international community. We're seeing a war without law, as well as seemingly a war without end. And we're seeing the breaching of some hard-won gains in international humanitarian law to do with the protection of civilians and the protection of aid workers. It's very, very striking that we're living in an age of the bombing of UN convoys, never mind the targeting of hospitals.
Never in our 30 years of documenting attacks on health professionals and hospitals seen anything like what the government of Bashar al-Assad has done to health in Syria. Here, unlike many of the other examples that we've documented, we see a government that is deliberately using a strategy of attacking hospitals, health facilities, medics, doctors, nurses, as a strategy of war.
Syria has been a devastating civil war, and it's been devastating to the people on the ground, but also to our partners and to our staff. I mean, we were, from September to early December, probably losing a staff person every other day.
It's hard to overestimate the longevity and scale of the death, destruction, suffering, and instability of Syria's human tragedy. Since the civil war began in 2011, more than 400,000 people have been killed and millions more wounded. According to the United Nations, more than 11 million Syrians have fled their homes. That's roughly half of the nation's pre-war population. 5 million are refugees, the majority settling in overburdened neighboring states. Frustrated and under increasing pressure, many made a dangerous bid to enter Europe. That continent is struggling with the social, political, and economic strains caused by the sudden mass arrival of nearly 1 million refugees. Many claim the collapse of the medical infrastructure in Syria propelled the mass exodus.
The health facilities, especially the hospitals, are the artery of life. If you don't have hospitals, if you don't have surgeons, pediatricians, if you don't have gynecologists to make the deliveries, you can't live a normal life.
When people don't have a place to seek medical help, when they don't have doctors, they don't have schools, they don't have a way of making a living, they just begin to lose faith in the overall system. And you imagine what it would be like if you lived in a city and you knew there was only one doctor left for everyone. Wouldn't you leave? Wouldn't you want to pick up and go?
According to Physicians for Human Rights, there have been more than 450 attacks on medical infrastructure, hitting some 300 healthcare facilities inside Syria. More than 800 medical professionals have been killed in the conflict. The majority lost their lives through shelling or aerial bombardment. But nearly a quarter were shot, and dozens were executed and tortured to death.
The intention is to make it impossible to reach health care, and the strategy of the government appears to be to see that hospitals and health care in opposition areas are actually the enemy. This is devastating and unlike anything we've ever seen.
The Assad government and Russia have repeatedly denied that the attacks on healthcare are deliberate and systematic.
If there's such attack from the army, it could be by mistake, but we don't have any information that thing has happened. All what we have is allegations, and only in the Western media, not from Syria.
Susanna Sirkin and her colleagues track attacks on healthcare workers. Their research has concluded that the Assad regime and its allies are responsible for more than 90% of the deaths and attacks on the medical community. And although the numbers are much smaller, the Islamic State group and other non-state actors have been linked to the killing of dozens of medical care workers in Syria. The steady stream of attacks on Aleppo and its hospitals became too much for neurosurgeon Rami Kalazi and his young family. They fled to Turkey, but thought it would be temporary. We caught up with him in November of 2016.
I love Aleppo City. I love to be a field surgeon, so I'll try to go back whenever it is possible.
A few weeks after the interview, the Assad regime and its allies launched an offensive to take back the rebel-held areas of Aleppo. More than 1,200 people died, including 600 civilians. thousands barely made it out alive. Khalazin never returned to the city. Millions of his fellow Syrian refugees are also unlikely ever to return when the war ends, given the scale of destruction of health and other civilian infrastructures. Although the scale of attacks on healthcare workers and medical centers is the most dramatic in Syria, many believe that it's emblematic of a wider development across several conflicts.
The danger is that the breaches that we're seeing in Syria that have been the exception become the norm in conflicts and civil wars. This is a period when there's the danger of vacuum around the world and a danger for the abuse of power by states that are strong enough to do so. The international sense of conscience and consciousness that led to the responsibility to protect in the early 2000s has certainly been eroded. And I think that should give us concern.
We've entered a period of new barbarianism. States and non-states alike across a spectrum of armed conflicts are actively preying on health workers, destroying health infrastructure, and attacking other humanitarians, shredding international norms. A recent study has detailed how this phenomenon has come to encompass 23 countries. We see aerial bombardments, we see the deliberate murder and targeting of health workers, we see the occupation of health facilities by armed groups. We're seeing the complete cessation of multiple health programs, permanent damage to infrastructure, flight of health workers, and dangerous outbreaks of infectious diseases.
The visibility of the MSF flag, the values, the treating all patients, which gave us some sense of safety, some security in these really fluid environments, has really sort of come away as essentially a hospital has become part of the battlefield. It's become, in the eyes of some combatants, a legitimate target. And the act of providing medical care to the enemy, once ensconced in the Geneva Conventions, is an incredibly important facet of where we define some sense of humanity amidst all of this chaos, is really getting eroded away.
Historically, NGOs were seen as, good people coming to help, and they were not being targeted. Now we're seeing, not just by the military, but by fighting forces on the ground. If you look at Somalia, if you look at other places in the DRC in Yemen, we're seeing NGOs becoming more of a target. And the NGO logo that used to be a protection, now actually it's become a target. It attracts attacks.
Beyond the tragedy of the attack itself and the loss of life, it has far-reaching consequences because it will affect the whole range of communities and population who won't be able to get appropriate medical treatment, and people will die.
Ken Isaacs is a veteran humanitarian worker who's worked in several of the world's deadliest conflicts over the last 30 years, including the 1994 genocide in Rwanda. His organization, Samaritan's Purse, an evangelical aid group, was one of only 3 international humanitarian groups operating in the country at the time.
How old is she?
4 years.
Despite the brutality of the various parties to the conflict, Isaac says Samaritan's Purse was not directly under threat.
They gave us space. They respected us. They may come back and hassle us later about this issue or that issue, but I never felt in that entire time that I was under consideration to be killed, or that they were going to attack us or hurt us.
Isaacs believes that respect for humanitarian workers by many parties in conflict zones is gone.
And now today I look at what's going on in South Sudan, and it's an absolute nightmare. In the center of the famine area, 15 of our staff were targeted and abducted. One of the local armed groups came in through the back of our compound wall, abducted 8 of our staff, went back out the opening, and marched them to the other end of town, where they went house to house and collected 7 more of our staff. They knew where they were, they targeted them. They brought them out, they marched them through the swamp all the next day. Our staff were convinced that they were going to be executed. The issue was not against Samaritan's Purse, but that they didn't want humanitarian people there feeding the people in a famine zone. And so they were trying to drive us out, and I don't understand that logic.
The time is 1949. The place, the Palace of Nations, Geneva, Switzerland. 59 nations have met to create and set up an improved set of rules to provide...
The Geneva Conventions were intended to prevent such mistreatment and targeting of aid workers. Out of the ashes of World War II, the conventions were updated in 1949 to include specific provisions which protect medical staff, humanitarian workers, civilians, and even wounded combatants. Over the following decades, more protections were added to the international agreement. There is debate among the humanitarian community on whether the increasing disregard for the international agreements is a continuation and expansion of trends, or a fundamentally new and different phenomenon.
The answer is both are at play. The roots of what we're seeing today were laid down 30 years ago. In the 80s and accelerating into the 90s, there was a proliferation of armed conflicts in the Philippines, in the Balkans, in Central America, where states and non-state actors alike chose to use armed violence against the health sector and humanitarians, and discovered that as a deliberate act of war, it actually worked with very few penalties. And those lessons were not lost on those who carried out subsequent wars. The other thing that happened in the 80s and 90s was our capacity to document improved. As a human rights movement came into being, as there was a deployment of UN peacekeeping operations, NGOs, and other emergency humanitarian operations into these conflicts, as technology made it possible for media to record these events more closely.
In the 90s, documentation continued to improve, and the end of the Cold War saw an uptick in internal wars. Hospitals and health clinics were bombed in Bosnia, Chechnya, Kosovo, and elsewhere. In Colombia, government and rebel forces targeted and killed dozens of medical workers.
Health workers were kidnapped and targeted for both ransom, and they were murdered. And at the end of that decade in Sri Lanka, in a 5-month period in 2009, Sri Lankan army bombed hospitals more than 30 times. 10 hospitals were hit a total of 30 plus times. More than 250 people were killed.
The surging power of social media has driven revolutionary changes in the speed and sophistication of documentation.
Technology allows us to see very vividly these terrible, tragic events. But we also need to see the big picture. What we see today is indeed a far more terrible and brutal period in which the scale and scope of violence against the health sector has expanded dramatically. The Middle East is particularly riven by war and deliberate violence against humanitarian operations. Chronic wars in Africa continue unabated, and we've entered the period of counterterrorism post 9/11, in which it's become exceedingly difficult at times to discriminate between humanitarian operations and activities that support terrorism, and that line has been blurred. We've also entered a period in which aerial campaigns are being used as a key device against terrorism, with limited presence on the ground, and that's led to several episodes of tragic violence against humanitarians.
Since 9/11, the whole effort at counterterrorism globally has had a profound impact on the insecurity of healthcare. And that's because health services are being considered by many regimes to be a form of support of terrorism if the patient is deemed, not necessarily is, but is deemed to be a terrorist. In Syria, the entire opposition is deemed to be a terrorist group. Patients, civilians living there are deemed to be part of the terrorist operation.
Leonard Rubinstein argues counterterrorism campaigns across several theaters have often crippled healthcare, and that not enough care has been taken to distinguish between military and civilian targets.
In part, it's hard. In part, they don't want to. In part, even if you want to, it's extremely difficult to do it. So that is why we're in a crisis. The combination of the Syria impunity and the counterterrorism kind of ideology and law has brought us to a crisis that is different from the past.
It's obviously not new for global powers to be involved in civil wars. That happened in the 60s and 70s, and there was great humanitarian suffering at the same time. What's different is two things. First of all, the degree of global media and the ability of images to get around the world fast. And secondly, there's the major new element, which is the roiling within the Islamic world, or large parts of the Islamic world, that define parts of the conflicts in Syria, in Afghanistan, elsewhere.
Dr. Joanne Liu of Doctors Without Borders sees today a widespread fear, a priority focus on security that leads states to downplay the individual with sweeping consequences.
It's normal that the security of the citizen is your core preoccupation, but can it be the sole lens to what you're gonna act and interact with other nations and what I call worldwide challenges? I think it's questionable. I do find that phenomena in tainting everything, from the response to epidemic to the response to the phenomena of migrants and refugee or forced displacement to the way wars are waged.
"1,300 miles southeast of Syria, in Yemen, another colossal humanitarian catastrophe has unfolded. Aid groups there have struggled and failed to keep up with the desperate needs of victims of Yemen's expansive war. And unlike Syria, large numbers of Yemenis have not fled the country. They are locked in by geographical boundaries and no financial means to escape. The conflict and its victims have been remarkably invisible to the rest of the world. Mohammed is one of millions of children whose lives have been turned upside down by the conflict. His parents rushed him to a nearby hospital after the airstrike. But he was turned away because there weren't enough doctors at the facility, and the area was bombarded by shelling and aerial attacks. He had to travel hundreds of kilometers to finally receive care in Yemen's capital. The country's healthcare system, which was already fragile, has been in near collapse since the war broke out in 2015. Shown here at a rally with its supporters, the Shia rebel Houthi movement took control of Sana'a in September of that year, and then grabbed other sections of the country. The group's offensive ultimately led sitting Yemeni President Abdurrabbu Mansur Hadi to flee to Saudi Arabia. The Houthis are accused of drawing support from Iran. Their objective is to return ousted dictator Ali Abdullah Saleh to power. Forces loyal to President Hadi have been trying to beat the Houthis into submission with heavy air support from Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, oftentimes indiscriminately killing civilians or injuring them with severe burns from bombings. That Gulf coalition has received weapons and targeting support from the United States. In May 2017, the United States signed a $110 billion defense deal with Saudi Arabia, its principal objective to counter Iranian influence and promote regional security. It also included support for the Saudi aerial campaign in Yemen. In the meantime, the U.S. conducts its own strikes on al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, or AQAP, which controls several pockets inside Yemen. These strikes and other counter-terror actions have at times caused civilian casualties. As the war and the battle against militants has escalated, the nation has become even more splintered.
It is deeply divided by tribe, and within many areas this creates insecurity to the point where it's almost impossible for outsiders to move. So take a country which was almost at the poverty line or below it for much of its population. How long does it take before you have a massive humanitarian impact?
The answer, not long at all. According to UNICEF, the number of citizens needing humanitarian assistance in Yemen has surged to 70% of the country's population. Many receive nothing. The toll hits children especially hard. By the spring of 2017, nearly 500,000 were severely malnourished. Many passed away from starvation. 15 million Yemenis have been also shut off from healthcare access. That's more than half of the country's population.
The medical facilities throughout Yemen should stop being targeted, and that medical supplies should be allowed to come in here and be given to the people and the patients in this facility who need them.
Repeated pleas from the international humanitarian community have had no significant impact.
We're seeing organizations and clinics being targeted by everybody. Now, we hear quite a bit about the Saudi attacks on clinics and hospitals, but the Houthis are doing pretty much the same. We don't hear about it that much. But there's absolutely no respect for organizations, for humanitarian principles.
Ascertaining whether a health center has been deliberately targeted is exceedingly difficult in the midst of violent chaos and a terribly neglected health infrastructure. However, the numbers remain alarming. UNICEF reports 93 attacks on Yemen's hospitals from March 2015 to December 2016. 8 buildings have also been hit, including this one, which belonged to the International Medical Corps in the city of Taiz. The US-based organization has committed to staying in Yemen, despite having its staff injured and even abducted by rebels and held for days before release. Giorgio Trombatori was the IMC's country director in Yemen until June 2017. We spoke to him before his departure as he and his colleagues struggled through daily hazards to deliver services to desperate Yemenis.
The country is totally disconnected with the entire world, completely. The impact on the situation is massive.
Coastal blockades are as equally devastating to the humanitarian situation as airstrikes. The Gulf Coalition has deliberately blocked the movement of food, fuel, emergency relief, and medicines through Yemen's major port cities. Even if aid does enter the country, there are countless other barriers to clear.
And the movement is crazy in Yemen. Wherever you move around Sana'a, you see destroyed buildings, there's a lot of checkpoints, there's a lot of challenges and limitations. If you want to move from Sana'a, when I regularly go to Hib, you can go through like maybe 100 checkpoints. Can you imagine if you are a businessman moving with your trucks, and in every checkpoint you need to pay, you lose time, hours, and you need special permissions. Even the movement of a basic need like a drug, it is a nightmare. You need authorization. We had the situation where we sent drugs, to Hib, and then they were confiscated. Sometimes you're dealing with in checkpoints with young soldiers that they don't even know how to read, that they want to to show their authority by hindering your work.
In the summer of 2017, the humanitarian catastrophe ballooned even further with an explosion of cholera.
Yemen's cholera outbreak is unlike anything we have seen in the modern era. Over 500,000 cases, over 2,000 fatalities. These are astronomical numbers. This is what you get when war destroys health, water, and sanitation systems, and when people stop being paid as the state implodes. The World Health Organization, the World Bank, and UNICEF have recently mobilized to bring assistance to Yemen, but they face the reality of continued political and military stalemate. They face the reality that Yemen is a cage.
Trambatori says Yemenis have lost hope.
And you have a population which I think in the last 2 years, they don't even know anymore what to expect. There is a civil war, there is an international war, you have militants. I think when you speak with the people, there is a general sense of loss.
Although the humanitarian crisis is largely off the minds of the American public, it has sparked a significant pushback in Washington by some Democratic and Republican lawmakers who question the U.S.'s role in the Saudi-led military offensive.
The impending famine in Yemen may reach biblical proportions. Think about that. It's astounding what's going on there, and it's being done without your permission, but with your weapons.
The Saudis are deliberately trying to create a famine inside Yemen in order to essentially starve the Yemenis to the negotiating table.
You saw a very heated debate in the Senate trying to block the precision-guided munitions. You had almost half the Senate coming out against the sale of these munitions, and that is a remarkable sea change. It has to do not only with a question of regional dynamics, but it has to do with what's been happening on the ground, the absence of any accountability, the absence of an acknowledgement that all these civilians are dying, and that actually might not be in the interest of the United States and the coalition long term.
Proponents of the larger arms deal to the kingdom argue that several $100 million dedicated to the training of Saudi forces and radar systems will curtail civilian casualties. That's, of course, just one aspect of the increasingly complex landscape of the war in Yemen, as Washington continues to debate its own role.
We cannot become Russia. We cannot sacrifice international humanitarian law to raw security interests, nor can we retreat. U.S. leadership remains essential. We need to guarantee our own security interests while pressing the Saudis to protect civilians, while pressing the parties in Yemen for a political resolution, and while urging expanded humanitarian access. Yemen should not be forgotten.
Afghanistan, the site of the U.S.'s longest war, is still very much a nation racked with violence and bloodshed, despite pockets of calm and oftentimes appearances that life has returned to normal. Dr. Esmatullah Esmat is no stranger to that violence and bloodshed. He fought to keep the fathers, mothers, sons and daughters of the various sides in war alive as a surgeon for MSF, or Doctors Without Borders. Esmat was based on what many regarded as a crown jewel medical facility in northern Afghanistan's Kunduz province.
It was a very good hospital for all peoples. All the services were free for peoples, and they accept all kind peoples. There was no difference between rich and poor and civilian, army.
Doctors Without Borders negotiated its ability to function as a neutral healthcare facility with the Taliban and Afghan government and treated wounded combatants on both sides, provided they left weapons in war at the hospital's door. The Afghan military took control of the region as the US-led NATO combat mission ended in the country at the end of 2014. The US and its international partners continued to play a role in support and training, but their intelligence gathering capability was significantly curtailed after the handover. In late September 2015, the Taliban launched a surprise attack, capturing control of Kunduz city within hours as Afghan forces quickly and fully retreated to the city's airport. A US Special Forces team was called in to help, and after beating back the Taliban at the airport, it launched an offensive to take back parts of Kunduz city with various Afghan forces. In the early morning hours of October 3rd, Afghan commandos requested US airstrike cover for a raid they were planning on an intelligence building, which had been taken over by the Taliban, not far from the Doctors Without Borders facility. A series of breakdowns followed, including equipment malfunction, a verbal description error of the target site, and a failure to relay the coordinates of the hospital as a no-strike zone to the US gunship. The confluence of these events was catastrophic.
When I hear a big blast sound, I wake up from sleep. All the glasses was bricked and fallen down on the floor and on me, and there was dust, smoke around inside the room and in the corridor. I broke the windows and I jumped from window. I found a small hole and I sit in this hole.
After the first US bombs hit the hospital, Doctors Without Borders staff contacted both American and Afghan officials, but the attack continued for another 30 minutes. Dr. Esmet and his colleagues struggled to stay alive.
With each blast, there was a big dust, smoke, and we think we will die soon. All our friends, at first they got injured, then they died. They burned in the fire.
The attack on Kunduz was a sustained attack over an hour, despite the fact that all the parties knew us, had our GPS coordinate. We must say that it was our biggest loss in terms of lives. 42 people died, 14 of our staff.
The Kunduz attack was so devastating because just months earlier we had seen a hospital that was providing really care at a tremendously high level, really complex surgical procedures and care. And to have that destroyed was also, had a very, I think it's fair to say, quite a significant psychological blow for us as an organization trying to provide care on the front lines.
Hundreds of thousands of Afghans have lost access to the healthcare facility since it closed after the attack. Doctors Without Borders won't restart operations in the area until it's confident its sites will be protected. The U.S. Department of Defense initially stated that an airstrike to defend U.S. forces on the ground may have produced collateral damage to a nearby medical facility. But weeks later, the Pentagon confirmed that a U.S. AC-130 gunship had in fact attacked the hospital.
This was a tragic mistake.
We thought, all of the proper procedures in place in order to avoid something like that. And certainly the pilots, every soldier, airman is instructed on the law of war and what targets are legitimate and not. And so clearly something had gone wrong.
All members of both the ground force and the AC-130 aircrew were unaware that the aircraft was firing on a medical facility throughout the engagement.
In its final report, the Pentagon reaffirmed that the incident was an accident and was not a war crime. 16 members of the U.S. military were disciplined, 12 personnel were suspended and removed from command, received reprimand letters and extensive retraining.
I am satisfied that the military is being held accountable for these mistakes. I'm not overjoyed, very frankly, that some of the higher-ups have not been disciplined, but I put it in a very different category than what we've seen from the Russians, from Bashar Assad, and from what we've seen in other conflicts.
The U.S. government has definitely gone through a thorough investigation. We, of course, would have liked it to be a little more independent. MSF, we're not impartial. We're the victims. We can't possibly be impartial in this circumstance. But nor can a certain way of investigating these things solely through the Pentagon.
Although some have criticized the investigation for not being independent, many have been encouraged by the Defense Department's review of its policies and the creation of a statement of principles in the wake of Kunduz to protect medical care provided by impartial humanitarian organizations and its improved contact and coordination with aid groups.
We realized that we needed to improve our communication with the NGOs on the ground. The statement of principles was basically just that. We tried to eliminate ambiguity where possible. We tried to make sure that they had an understanding of the way we approach trying to make sure that we are able, in the midst of a combat zone, to respect international humanitarian law. And that exercise, I think, was good for both sides.
They have been changing. I think that we've seen more outreach from the military. We've seen more education that the Department of Defense is doing actually for their military commanders, as well as inviting more NGOs. We've been invited to certain discussions that we were never invited to because it used to be just military. We've seen even the US military taking that incident very seriously and disciplining people and putting systems in place to avoid such an incident in the future, which is very encouraging. And I wish other military actually would do the same.
However imperfect, the Department of Defense demonstrated considerable resolve and seriousness of purpose in dealing with the Kunduz tragedy, and some good came out of that. We're likely to see more instances like Kunduz in the future as aerial campaigns continue. We need to work hard to guarantee and strengthen the transparency of U.S. operations and improve the trust and confidence of the NGO sector. The legacy of Kunduz and the continued debate over it will, we hope, guide future U.S. action.
As the onslaught proceeds against humanitarian workers in several conflicts, there's concern that little can be done to stop it, apart from a nation or insurgent group policing itself.
Well, the deep, dark secret, which isn't a secret, is that there really isn't much in the way of international community. The phrase is used all the time, but it's quite thin. The whole idea of responsibility to protect, which was embraced just over a decade ago, now you couldn't get people to support it, I believe.
That concern, fueled by the steep rise in attacks, propelled NGOs to launch a public campaign to press major powers into action.
We believe that war stopped at the door of our hospital, and we want to preserve that. And we want to preserve access to health care in war zones. That's a battle that's worth to fight.
Broad attacks on communities and precise attacks on health facilities are described as mistakes, are denied outright, or are simply met with silence.
These are not collateral damages. These are not sad realities we have to get used to. They are abominations to fight and trends to roll back.
The efforts by humanitarian groups helped lead to a unanimous vote on May 3, 2016, at the United Nations Security Council. It passed Resolution 2286, which condemned attacks on healthcare workers and demanded compliance with international humanitarian laws.
Wars have rules. It is time to uphold and enforce them. Though government should stand by and watch the erosion of safeguards for the protection of civilians in conflict, the international community must never become numb to flagrant abuses.
At the vote, Dr. Liu put each of the 15 members of the Security Council on notice.
The discussion here today cannot amount to empty rhetoric. This resolution cannot end up like so many others, including those passed on Syria over the past 5 years, routinely violated with impunity.
The following months revealed the hollowness of Resolution 2286 as attacks continued across multiple conflicts.
Imagine a slaughterhouse. This is worse. Even a slaughterhouse is more humane. The global public does not distinguish between member states, the Security Council, and Secretary General. They only know one thing. The world has let them down.
5 months later, the resolution has plainly failed.
The people of eastern Aleppo are literally dying in their streets. They are maimed and wounded by airstrikes carried out by Russia and the Assad regime, and they are unable to receive treatment because of the medieval siege Russia and the Syrian regime have imposed.
After voting for 2286 months before, Russia in September flatly rejected that the resolutions applied to the Syrian government or its own actions inside the country.
Instead of seeking a collective solution, the representatives of states directly responsible for fanning the flames of enmity in Syria at the Security Council and other forums engage in anti-Russia demagoguery. What we can see now in the media represents public speculation based on the suffering of people for propaganda purposes.
Many believe that significant international action to stop the killing and targeting of humanitarian workers won't happen in the near future, and that the Geneva Conventions and other humanitarian laws aren't enough to end the increasingly brutal actions of state and non-state actors alike in today's world.
The Geneva Conventions were designed for responsible nation states and the way they conduct wars. Geneva Conventions were not designed to deal with irregular combat. Because of that, there have been egregious abuses where the Geneva Conventions don't really serve a deterrent to people that are abusing them.
International law, conventions, and the like are relevant in the sense that they set standards or norms, but virtually none of them are self-enforcing. And at the end of the day, norms are really only as powerful as governments want them to be. The United Nations is only as meaningful as the great powers want it to be on any particular day or any particular issue.
There's not much enforcement that works, but the reality is we don't have much of leverage.
Many humanitarian leaders say pressing world powers publicly is one of the only tools still left for NGOs to fight the tide of attacks.
But when it's the talk of the town, it gets attention, and getting attention, somehow having an issue being visible at that level, it brings to a certain extent, and you may say I'm naive, but some protection.
Others believe the information campaigns will have more effect in the future.
I wish I could say that these data were stopping the attacks, or were creating at least some measure of accountability. To date, they have not. But we have no doubt that one day these will be prosecuted in a court of law somewhere.
I think people will be held accountable differently in different conflicts. In Syria, where you have a relatively well-educated population with access to social media and various sophisticated ways of collecting and transferring information, yes. There are other conflicts that are less visible. You have less sophisticated actors able to collect the evidence that would enable that kind of accountability.
War crime prosecutions have had a mixed record, including ones at the International Criminal Court, which has been criticized for being too slow and only pursuing cases against perpetrators from the weakest nations. As all of these efforts are attempted, and without a clear end in sight, medical and other humanitarian providers have taken matters into their own hands to strengthen their protections.
I think it's very important that we're not just big-hearted humanitarians, but that we're also hard-headed humanitarians. Obviously, there's a premium now on risk assessment. We want to do everything we can to ensure that we're deploying people with the maximum of protection, subject to the obvious point that we don't arm ourselves and we don't arm our people.
Doctors started to establish their hospitals in secret places, in chicken farms, in factories, in deserted buildings, in basements of churches and mosques. And then the second phase started to dig these hospitals either underground or in caves or in the heart of mountains.
Dr. Zahir Salul and others from the Syrian American Medical Society, or SAMS, have provided support for the remote and hidden hospitals in Syria. In addition to making covert trips inside the country to perform surgeries on victims of the war, oftentimes at great risk.
Bombs and missiles would land so close, sometimes they'd knock you off your feet. You'd be in the emergency room or an operating room and a bomb would land and the hospital would shake, the foundations would shake, dust would settle, and you'd feel that there are times you felt like you might find yourself on the floor dead or crippled next to the people you were trying to help.
Daily, those on the front lines of this fight simply refuse to give up. Those in diplomatic trenches, those who document abuses, and those heroic first responders who provide assistance directly to the most vulnerable under extreme threat. But the stark reality is that these efforts, while absolutely essential, are not enough to stem the tide of violence. Those on the front lines cannot succeed by themselves. They need help.
This reality begs the core question: what else should be done?
The Geneva Conventions face a crisis today, but we need to put that crisis in historical context. In the 150 years of international humanitarian law, there's really never been a golden era per se. There's always been a struggle to win compliance, to deter abuse, to bring about effective protection and accountability. There have also been eras of profound darkness amid deep changes in warfare in the late 19th century and during and after World War I and World War II. And out of each of those horrors came advances in international humanitarian law. We may be at a similar historical moment today. We need to seize that moment and test what is possible. It requires us to deal strategically and systematically with the changes in warfare and in the world at large. It requires us to come to terms post 9/11 with ISIS and Al-Qaeda, with a global insecurity, with continued protracted counter-terror campaigns. It requires dealing with states, major powers that flagrantly defy international humanitarian law, even while embracing that law officially. It requires addressing the violent widening disorder in the world, wars that are not resolved, wars that are generating untold numbers of refugees and displaced persons. The U.S., for its part, has a special obligation to acknowledge its weaknesses, its inconsistencies, and to take special action to correct those. The U.S. needs to adhere to a higher standard. It needs to set an example that others will follow. Some are arguing in this country that the United States should retreat from world engagement. But in this fragile historical moment, the U.S. cannot afford to take a back seat.
There is no substitute for American leadership in the world. And when that leadership departs and becomes leading from behind, then vacuums are created and bad things happen. America must lead and set the example.
I do think we have a responsibility, and while we protect the interests of the United States, I think one of the fundamental interests we have are our values. They may be achieved over time and may not sometimes have the immediacy of our very piquant interests, but they are our interests.
We should be going back and to reassess what is the foundation of the Geneva Conventions for the 21st century. We're dealing with combat conditions that were never anticipated. And we can't simply assume that because they exist, that they are held as being valid by average citizens. We need to go back and revalidate the importance of this for America going forward. And then how do they have to be adapted given these new conditions of warfare?
We, of course, cannot go it alone. We have to act in concert with others to address the most glaring gap, the absence of high-level political leadership. Any solution requires a committed, sustained international coalition, a core of statesmen, stateswomen, military leaders committed to placing the vulnerable individual at the very center.
I think it's very important that we don't lower our standards, that we don't become susceptible to the fatigue that can set in, because the truth is we have no excuse for that attitude. These hard-won gains after the Second World War need to be defended.
It may be a slow process. The Geneva Convention itself did not happen overnight, so we have to keep trying because it is about who we are as human beings.
If you look at the facts, you get depressed, and if you look at the people, you have hope. And so when one sees the resilience and the spirit and the ability to bounce back of people in conflict situations, then we have no excuse living comfortable lives to give up hope.